Hello, Internet. So last week, the Polish Parliament passed a law that has stirred up a bit of a shitstorm. This law criminalizes the use of the phrase Polish death camps, meaning the concentration and extermination camps that the Nazis set up in occupied Poland during World War II. Now, I disagree with this law on principle. I don't believe any speech should be criminalized. But in this video, I want to talk more about the phrase and some of the reactions it has gotten. Now, any criticism of this law based on freedom of speech, I believe is absolutely valid and I agree with. But a lot of the critics have claimed that Poland is trying to whitewash its history with this law. It's trying to erase Polish crimes. But that's not at all what's happening. No one's denying that there were Polish individuals during the war who committed despicable acts, collaborating with the Nazis and turning Jews over to them and helping them murder. But these individuals were very much a minority. In fact, the Armia Krajowa, the Polish resistance, set up underground courts to try and convict collaborators of treason. And one of the acts they considered to be treasonous was denouncing Jews in hiding and turning them over to the Nazis. But the phrase Polish death camps has nothing to do with individuals. It implicates the entire Polish population in what were Nazi crimes. Some of the strongest reactions have come out of Israel, from the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that he strongly disagrees with the law, to this wonderfully eloquent, beautifully articulated tweet from an Israeli journalist. And then there's these tweets from Israeli politician Yair Lapid. And if I'm saying his name wrong, I really don't care. Anyways, he had this to say. I utterly condemn the new Polish law which tries to deny Polish complicity in the Holocaust. It was conceived in Germany, but hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered without ever meeting a German soldier. There were Polish death camps, and no law can ever change that. So I have no idea where he's getting this idea that hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered without ever meeting a German soldier, which I believe he's implying they were murdered by Poles. As far as I can tell, he's just pulling this out of his ass because there's no evidence to support this. In fact, the Polish embassy to Israel replied to this tweet saying as much and telling him that maybe he should get himself educated about the Holocaust. And then he replied with this tweet. I am a son of a Holocaust survivor. My grandmother was murdered in Poland by Germans and Poles. I don't need Holocaust education from you. We live with the consequences every day in our collective memory. Your embassy should offer an immediate apology. Now, some intrepid fact-finding individuals on the internet went out and found some interesting information in reference to his claim that his grandmother was murdered in Poland by Poles. According to what these people could find, from an interview with Yair Lapid's mother, she said her parents were from Romania and moved to Palestine in 1934, 5 years before the war even began. So presumably that grandmother survived the war and was never murdered in Poland. In fact, as far as could be determined, she died in 1974, long after the war. And on his father's side, his paternal grandparents, his father's family was originally from Novi Sad in Serbia, which is not Poland. And his father and grandmother were taken to the Budapest ghetto, Budapest being in Hungary and not Poland, where they were liberated by the Soviets at the end of the war. So that's his other grandmother surviving the war in Hungary and not murdered in Poland. And his grandfather, however, was killed in the death camp of Mauthausen, which was in Austria, which is also not Poland. So it turns out that Mr. Lapid does need some Holocaust education and possibly even some education on his own family history because he's demonstrably full of shit. And apparently is, for some reason, very anti-Polish because he's accusing Poland of being complicit in the Holocaust. Clearly, he's never heard of Witold Pilecki, a member of the Polish underground who allowed himself to be captured by the Germans and sent to Auschwitz, which imprisoned more than just Jews, and spent 2 years in Auschwitz gathering information on what the Nazis were doing there, and then escaped so he could report what he found out in that camp. And yet he calls Poland complicit. Obviously, he's never heard of Jan Karski, who delivered reports of what the Nazis were doing in Europe and the extermination of Jews to the West and to President Roosevelt himself, where it fell on deaf ears. And yet Mr. Lapid calls Poland complicit. He's clearly never heard of Irena Sendler, who rescued hundreds of Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. And he calls Poland complicit. He's obviously never heard of the Żabiński family, Jan and Antonina, who used their zoo to shelter hundreds of Jews on their way to other hiding locations. And he calls Poland complicit. This accusation spits in the face of and spits on the memory of every Pole who risked not only their lives, but the lives of their families to help Jews. Because Poland was the only occupied country in Europe where the punishment for helping a Jew was not only death for yourself, but death for your family. Which is evidenced by the story of the Ulma family, who sheltered 8 Jews in their attic for nearly 2 years until they were discovered by the Nazis. And then Yusuf Ulma and his pregnant wife Victoria and their 6 children, ranging in ages from 8 to 2 years old, were brutally murdered by the Nazis for the crime of helping Jews. And yet, Mr. Lapid calls Poland complicit. Well, Yair Lapid, you can go fuck yourself. Auschwitz-Birkenau is not a Polish name. Arbeit macht frei is not a Polish phrase. There were no Polish death camps. And so I will end this video with an actual Polish phrase. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła.